Or you've got some gospel that was written way back then. Well, maybe Jesus was much simpler back then. He was just a preaching rabbi, just somebody who taught good moral truths. He never walked on water. He never rose from the grave. He wasn't born of a virgin. Well, let's go back and talk about a principle we haven't yet discussed. It's called the chain of custody. Well, if we have a crime scene from 30 years ago, we could simply ask, well, was there a detective or an officer at the scene 30 years ago who maybe saw that piece of evidence and photographed it with a Polaroid camera? Maybe he wrote a supplemental report in which he described it being at the scene. He's going to give that piece of evidence to somebody. If he checks it into property, they're going to write a report and talks about how they received it. What did it look like? Where did it come from? Maybe he gives it to my dad, who was back in those days working old cases. My dad was also a homicide detective. Maybe my dad got it from him and he took a Polaroid of his own or described in his report what that piece of evidence looked like. Then he brings it to the crime lab. They write a report. Then they bring it back out to our property room. Then they write a report. Then I pick it up from the property room and I write a report. Well, now I've got image after image after image, report after report after report, describing that piece of evidence over time. Linking it from the past to the present. And each person who describes that piece of evidence is like a link in a chain. And that's why we call this the chain of custody. And if you can demonstrate for a jury that you can show every link in the chain and how it hasn't changed link to link, you've got good reason to believe that your evidence hasn't been tampered with. Well, is there a New Testament chain of custody? Yeah, as a matter of fact, there is. For example, John, he writes a gospel. Well, okay, but how do you know the Gospel of John you have in your Bible today is unaltered from the original Gospel of John? Well, who are the next officers in the chain of custody he gave it to? He gave it to 3 of his students, 3 personal students of John who sat at his feet and listened to everything that John said about Jesus. Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias. These students of John wrote down what John told them. Well, yeah, but how could we access? Well, it turns out you're lucky. These became local leaders in the church, big leaders in the church, as a matter of fact, who wrote letters to local congregations. These letters still exist today. We can look at those letters to see what it is they're describing about Jesus, what it is that John told them about Jesus.